Recording on this computer, and we will also go live on Facebook. Get that approval, great. And then I will share my screen. We'll get this rolling. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. We'll let people in. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our forum on advocating for clean transportation in Wisconsin. We're going to give folks a minute just to get settled, change their names, and get settled in, make sure their sound is working, and we'll get on the road. So we're so excited to have so many great speakers with us today. So thank you for joining us. Yeah, so we'll just give it a minute. I'll take a sip of my coffee here and let folks get settled in. All right. Well, my watch says 10:02, so we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, this is an online forum advocating for clean transportation in Wisconsin. We're really excited to have Kevin Brubaker joining us for a keynote speech. He's from the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and then we'll be following that up with conversations on active transportation, public transit, and passenger rail. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat. We'll get to them at the end. We have a designated Q&A period at the end for each. So thank you again, for joining us for our forum today. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor, Godfrey & Kahn, who helped make this possible. So we appreciate them. And let's get the show on the road. So just a little bit of background. Who are we? Well, first of all, who am I? I'm Greg May. I'm the Transportation Policy Director at 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin. 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin was founded in 1996, so we just celebrated our 25th anniversary. We're a land use based nonprofit. We promote land use policies and activities that promote sustainable communities and positive economic outcomes and environmental benefits in Wisconsin, working statewide. And if you haven't heard of our program called Active Wisconsin, we run that program, which is a coalition of communities and advocacy groups all around the state who are dedicated to promoting walking and biking infrastructure in their communities. So there's some resource sharing there. We do some state level advocacy, a lot of interest in complete streets. So some really great work through that program. I would encourage you to visit our website, both the 1,000 Friends website and Active Wisconsin, just to get a little bit more information about who we are and see some of the great things we're doing. And speaking of that, just some organizational updates from what we've been doing in the last couple of months. On March 3rd, we sent a letter to Governor Evers and to Secretary Craig Thompson from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation that came from 30 organizations, and we were asking that the DOT prioritize infrastructure projects that promote equity and sustainability. That was based on a US DOT memo asking our states to invest in these kind of projects. So we're pushing for as much discretionary funds as is reasonably possible to go to walking and biking and transit infrastructure, passenger rail as well. On March 29th, we attended a live podcast in Milwaukee to discuss the future of I-794 there. That's the highway that is downtown that separates kind of downtown Milwaukee from the 3rd Ward neighborhood. And we're just kind of building on a grassroots movement there that's trying to turn that highway into a boulevard and reconnect those neighborhoods and make better connections to the lake. So we're really excited about that project. We'll be launching a website, Rethink 794 soon, so keep an eye out for that. And then I guess as a self-plug, just last week, I got to meet with the US DOT Secretary Pete Buttigieg, just learning some more about infrastructure funding in Wisconsin. So That was really exciting. And then one more thing to promote is our 2022 webinar series. If you haven't attended one of those, they've been really fun, really informational, exciting stuff. They're the third Wednesday of every month. So our next one is on May 18th. They run from 12 to 1. So just bring your lunch, learn a little bit about transportation in our communities here in Wisconsin. So we're really excited for our May 18th webinar, which is Active Summer Community Support for Outdoor Recreation. So we have Michelle Bacchus joining us from the Bicycle Federation, James Longhurst, who's a Sustainable Transportation Professor at UW-Cross, and Amy Lord, who's from the Ice Age Trail Alliance, just coming in to talk about, how to get active in the summer, what are some resources that are available, and how communities can support those resources. So I believe Susan has posted the link in the chat. So, if that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend you register for that webinar. We've had a ton of fun with them. And of course, sign up for our e-news on our website, if you want to stay informed about any of the activities 1,000 Friends is doing. And so without further ado, we'll throw it over to our keynote speaker, who we're really excited to be having join us today, it's Kevin Brubaker. Kevin is the Deputy Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center, which is ELPC. And he leads campaigns to improve environmental quality, to protect natural resources, and to put to practice ELPC's belief that environmental progress and economic development can be achieved together. And so we're really excited to have him joining us today because he has a really deep knowledge of transportation policy. He helps run their Midwest high-speed rail network project. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to Kevin.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. Let me attempt to share my screen here. Okay, so Greg, are you seeing my screen now?
I am. It looks great.
Terrific. So a suggestion for those of you who have control over it, if you would sort of split your screen about 50-50 between me and the pictures, you'll probably get the best experience. What I have is not a PowerPoint with dozens of exciting slides and tiny print. Rather, what I have is a few illustrations at particular points in my talk. And some of these slides will stay up for a while because it's too hard to take up and take down the screen share. At least for me, without messing up. So if you keep me a little larger and the pictures a little smaller, maybe it'll be a little more interesting. Again, thank you for having me. This is I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak with all of you. I wish it were in person. If it were, I suspect I would recognize about 2/3 of you in the audience. Good to be with you all again. As I was thinking about this presentation, I was reminded of a short cartoon I saw when I was about 10 years old. The premise of it was that some Martians had come to visit Earth, and in their flying saucer, flying over our cities, they had researched Earth and had gone back to Mars to report on what they'd found. And what they concluded was that automobiles were the dominant species on Earth, and that they had in fact enslaved human beings to serve them. They had trained human beings to build roads, to build parking lots, to build garages. They'd even trained human beings to feed them at gas stations. It was kind of fun, but it was provocative. And obviously, if I'm remembering that film from 50 years ago, it had some lasting impact on me. It's kept me thinking about our relationship with the car. And so in that spirit, I sort of want to offer a 50,000-foot view of surface transportation. So the place to begin, I think, is with the question, why do we travel? And to my way of thinking, we can really divide it into two big categories. The first is journeys, the second commutes. I'm going to talk briefly about journeys and then spend most of my time talking about commuting. Journeys are the special long distance trips we undertake. Today, it might be a trip to Disney World. 1,000 years ago, it was a pilgrimage to Canterbury. Journeys have always been a driver of economic activity. In fact, medieval churches collected relics for the same reason that Chicago purchased the bean sculpture a few years ago, namely to drive tourist dollars, to encourage journeys. Cities that support journeys thrive. You know, the old saw that all roads lead to Rome really is true. I don't know how many of you have seen this map. It's one I particularly like, sort of a New York Transit style map of the major roadways at the height of the Roman Empire. And you will see, in fact, all roads do lead to Rome. You think about cities since then that have thrived, it's been because of strong transportation networks. New York became a city because it had a natural harbor. Chicago became a city because it was the sort of the only place you could connect the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River Basin. Chicago later sort of doubled down on that by becoming a railroad hub. Atlanta as well, right? In Gone with the Wind, they burned Atlanta because that's where the railroads were. Today, the opportunity, the economic opportunity, is to connect our mega regions, those parts of our country that are full of people and jobs and economic activity, and the opportunity to both connect within those and connect betwixt them. And if you've ever heard me talk before, you know that ELPC firmly believes that intercity passenger rail is really the key to tapping this economic resource. It's a way to promote journeys in a way that's environmentally benign. Because of our history, most of our cities, exception of Madison, already have railroad stations. So it's fairly easy to locate this transportation nexus right in the heart of our downtowns. And in doing so, we can pull people, jobs, and businesses back into the urban core. It promotes intra-regional trade and tourism. By reducing the travel time, it brings smaller cities closer to big cities, and it strengthens our region's ability to compete in the international economy. I typically talk for 40 minutes on this topic, but I want to pass on and talk about the other kind of travel for the remainder of my time with you, and that's commutes. Commuting is not the life-transforming trip to the Dalai Lama or to the Grand Canyon or Disney World or whatever it is for you. It's the drudgery of getting to and from. And interestingly, the travel pattern hasn't really changed in 2,000 or 3,000 years. Throughout that time, people have demonstrated a willingness, on average, to travel about 30 minutes to work each day. Some people, of course, travel more, some less. You know, few have horrifically long commutes, but on average, the average commute tends to be about 30 minutes to work, 30 minutes home. In those places that required you to work further away, you would stay there. And so, for example, if the mountain pastures were more than 30 minutes from a village, you would stay in the equivalent of the Airbnb of the pre-20th century, a stone hut or something, until the season was over and you could return home. So this 30-minute journey has been the limitation on growth. With better roads, you could get further in 30 minutes than if you walk. And so, you know, with better roads, with horse-drawn wagons, the footprints of roads could gradually expand larger. With industrialization in the 19th century, cities became crowded. Became overcrowded, you know, the kind of city you read about in Charles Dickens, because a huge workforce was demanded for large textile mills, steel mills, and other factories. Too large a populace to be contained within a 30-minute walk of the factories. And so you had this kind of overcrowding. Technology provided two answers to this problem. The first was the elevator, so that we could grow up instead of out, and create, high rises, that is, buildings taller than 5 or 6 stories that you would want to walk in a staircase. And secondly, of course, the streetcars. Streetcars and commuter railroads allowed people to live within 30 minutes of their job, but over a much larger land area. And so what you end up with is these commuter villages, if you will, along near train stations, commuter lines. So instead of being a 30-minute walk from your job, you are a 30-minute walk from the train station in New Rochelle or Greenwich or whatever Evanston, Illinois, whatever the particular locale. And then you take a commuter railroad to work. And so the population could expand over a much larger area. And then, of course, came the automobile. The Long Island Expressway and other roads allowed people to live much further from their jobs and still commute 30 minutes. Cars themselves allowed people to spread out further. So instead of clustering around the railroad stations, people were spread out, and you had places like Levittown and modern suburbia, with which we are all so familiar. Ever since Levittown, we've been in this vicious cycle to solve congestion, right? You know the pattern. People move to the outer suburbs, the new suburb that's 30 minutes from work, because the housing is cheaper out there. You're away from people unlike yourself, variety of reasons. So a cheaper house, they've got a 30-minute commute to work, and other people join them. And soon the suburb fills, the road fills, and you bought a house that was 30 minutes from work, and now it's an hour from work. So you complain to your government about it. Government responds by expanding the road, so you get back your 30-minute commute. But in doing so, the farmland adjacent to your subdivision is now converted to a new suburb. So more people are on the road. It gets crowded again, your trip time goes up, and the cycle repeats itself indefinitely. Look what's happened to land use because of this. This is an overlay of the footprint of cities. At the center, you see you see Paris and Rome, which were probably about an hour's walk from one end to the other, given a 30-minute commute time, right? You can get anywhere, you can get say from the edge of the city to the center, a 30-minute walk. London, a little bit larger, a 30 minutes travel time by horse-drawn carriage on cobblestone streets. Chicago, in 1915, that's probably a 30-minute commute by the private sector predecessors of Chicago's L, would get you from the outer edges of the city to downtown. And then you've got Atlanta, which is a car-dependent city. And you can see the kind of land use that is inspired. So overlay all of this land use pattern with a heavy dose of racism, and you end up with decaying cities and inner ring suburbs and wealthy outer suburbs, with the cities themselves stuck maintaining a very expensive infrastructure to support a population that's no longer there. In Chicago, for example, we could easily house another 500,000 to 1 million people just in the western portion of the city, portion within city limits that is now largely vacant lots. But we're paying for the roads, the sewers, all the power lines, all the infrastructure to support a population that's no longer there. So, and what do the people who live in these outlying areas now want? More roads. The environmental costs of this pattern are huge. Transportation, as you probably know, is now the #1 source of climate change pollution in the United States. Over 35,000 people a year die in automobile crashes. Farmland, wetlands, natural habitats are consumed with our sprawling development. And the suburban McMansions themselves use far more energy than urban apartments. To sort of add insult to injury, we have not just technology driving this kind of thing, but we have public policies that are deliberately making the problem worse. First, we actually pay people to drive more. Politicians want to satisfy suburban voters' demand for more roads without offending them with higher gas taxes. So in a classic Washington violation of the dictum that you can't have your cake and eat it too, we have continued to spend more and more on through the federal highway program, while raising no more money through the federal gas tax, propping up this system with transfers from the general fund. Since 2008, about $100 billion has been transferred from the general fund to the highway trust fund. That is, people who no longer drive, don't drive for whatever reason, their taxes are going to build your roads. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed last November added an additional $90 billion in direct subsidies for highway building. Again, these are dollars earmarked for roads that came from, or the revenues come from something other than user fees. So in sum, over 20 years, we're paying people about $200 billion to drive more. Is it any wonder then that congestion, air pollution, energy consumption, all of these problems exist? Second, this $190 billion subsidy is dwarfed by the policies that ensure that local road construction, road maintenance, traffic enforcement, on-street parking are paid out of property taxes and by local government, regardless of whether you own an automobile or not. Third, we build roads without sidewalks and then wonder why nobody walks or bikes, as though the free market has somehow determined that driving an automobile is the only way that people want to get around. Fourth, through zoning, we're deliberately keeping people from living closer to their jobs. It's almost as though we'd uninvented the elevator in our efforts to keep land use exactly like it was 100 years ago. As an example, I live in Oak Park, Illinois, which is a town, in some ways very similar. It's a suburb of Chicago, culturally very similar to Madison. It's a liberal, relatively affluent place. The lower left of your screen, this is a picture of an older brick building. Above it is a proposal to replace that with this affordable housing unit building. And this is the neighborhood reaction. No more high rises. I will simply note the irony that the sign next to it is Black Lives Matter. I suspect you see the same thing in your communities as well. In San Francisco, home purchase is impossible for anyone who is not a millionaire because San Francisco will not allow denser development. All over the country, simple things like granny flats, apartments over businesses, and 3 flats are illegal in many places. It seems like everybody wants great restaurants in their neighborhood, but opposes the housing density necessary to support them. I mean, to put this in a little different context, imagine, if you will, that instead of talking about an addiction to cars, we're talking about an addiction to alcohol. Imagine living in a country where 35,000 people a year died of alcohol poisoning. And imagine if our government policies actually stipulated that a significant portion of the cost of booze came out of your property tax instead of your bar tab. Imagine zoning rules that had minimum requirements for taverns and bars in every neighborhood, perhaps even banning water bubblers, water fountains. And imagine a deliberate policy to subsidize drinking to the tune of $200 billion over a generation. If this existed, would anyone be surprised if we had a nation of alcoholics? So how do we get out of this cycle? I don't have the entire answer, but I have a few ideas, and I think we'll be talking about more of them throughout this conference today. First, spread the news that cheap gas was not promised by Moses, Muhammad, or the founding fathers. I got to tell you, my pet peeve is people who support the Ukrainians right now, who support our boycott of Russian goods, and in the same breath complain about high gas prices. That's the cost of defending freedom right now. Moreover, higher price gas will accelerate our move to electric vehicles in a cleaner future. High gas prices are a good thing, not a bad thing. Second, let's stop the road building Ponzi scheme. Every state, every few years, there's the transportation crisis of crumbling roads and bridges. So we raise state fuel taxes, we raise money to fix those roads, and instead we build new ones. We all know as homeowners, the solution to a leaky roof is not to build an addition to the back of the house, it's to fix the leaking roof. We need to inject this kind of common sense into a fix-it-first set of priorities around our transportation investment. Third, support upzoning. Denser development in our cities and inner ring suburbs is good for communities and it's good for the environment. It's also key to making housing more affordable. Let's call out the racist and classist opposition to denser development wherever we see it. Let's also look at the opportunities that exist in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. About half of the $552 billion in that act passed by Congress last November goes toward transportation. A lot of that goes to highways. You see at the bottom bar there, a significant increase in federal funding for highways. We need to remain vigilant about how our state DOTs spend those dollars. But there's also a lot more money for transit and a huge influx of funding for passenger rail. Let's take advantage of that. $66 billion for Amtrak and intercity rail is unprecedented. There's a new $1 billion program to reconnect communities that were severed by highway making decisions. That's not enough money to go very far, but it's enough to build a few demonstration projects around the country and build support so that the next transportation bill begins to much more forcefully address these bad decisions in the past. There's $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, up to $7.5 billion for electric buses, a $6.5 billion new program for carbon reduction, and lots of competitive grant programs, which we can ensure become a race to the top for the best transportation investments we can make. We also have a threat and an opportunity from COVID. As obviously COVID changed everything. But as Rahm Emanuel once famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. Everywhere, because of COVID, transit ridership plummeted. Work from home became a real thing for many people for the first time. But at the same time, I think the role of transit for many of us became very, very clear for the first time. People like me were able to work from home because essential workers at groceries, pharmacies, power plants, and elsewhere were able to take public transit to work. We need to think about public transit not just as, what's in it for me, but rather as a piece of social infrastructure to allow us to exist as a society. Even if I never get in a bus or a train again, it's good for me and good for my community that essential workers have reliable, safe, affordable transit available to them. Obviously, commuting patterns have changed. And anybody who tells you they know what the future of the office and commuting is going to be is wrong. if we've learned anything in the last 2 years, it's that we can't really predict the future. So we need to encourage our transit agencies to be nimble, be constantly reinventing themselves. I'll tell you, here in Chicago, our regional transit authority has just begun a strategic planning process. And they began their first public meeting by saying that, as a matter of principle, the agency was open to change. And the 150 transit and transportation advocates who participated in that basically threw a fit and pushed back and said, it is not sufficient for a transit agency to be open to change. You have to embrace change. And to their credit, they have acknowledged that. And they've changed the mission of their approach to this planning to be embracing change rather than simply, admitting it might be possible. In conclusion, there's a lot of threats, there's a lot of opportunities. I'm nevertheless optimistic. First, technology is moving us quickly toward electric vehicles and the renewable power necessary to charge them. I mean, when I was a kid, the only electric vehicle imaginable was a golf cart. Today, one can easily purchase an electric vehicle. There's lots of options. We're beginning to see changes in the public perception of zoning. Upzoning is starting to become a thing. And maybe the ball is starting to roll. We can keep it moving in that direction. And lastly, for me personally, the war in Ukraine has been a good reminder that I live in a democracy, that I have power over my government, that we all do. And that by working together, by sharing our vision of what a sustainable, livable environment can look like with good transportation choices, we can truly make a difference. And this conference is one way to do that. Stick around, there's some awesome presentations later. I look forward to participating with all of you. With that, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I hope there's some time for dialogue. Thank you.
My goodness, thank you so much, Kevin. What an excellent presentation. I had a couple of people sending me direct messages saying, the preacher of transportation. I got a couple of text messages. One of them, oh my God, snaps for Kevin. So I'm getting some positive feedback from folks here. Yeah, so we've got time for maybe about 7 or so minutes for questions or so. So if folks have a question or two, we'd love to get to them in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. This has been, just so, I don't know, a great way to kick off this conference, getting us thinking about these high-level ideas. And I'm curious, just, as we, move forward, with infrastructure money and, kind of DLPC's mission of combining, environmental rules or kind of environmental progress with economic progress. Is there, a way you're thinking about some of this infrastructure money and how we can both be more sustainable with it, but also kind of grow our cities and some of the economic development ideas behind that?
Yeah, so first and foremost, what's closest to my heart is intercity passenger rail, right? With the new money available, we will finally have a second daily train along the Chicago-Milwaukee Twin Cities corridors, hopefully within a year or so. That's phenomenal. It'll now become, a real transportation choice. There's money to finally pick up where Wisconsin left off with, when Scott Walker came in, and get the train line to Madison. The logic of that corridor has never diminished. There is continued interest in increasing the train frequency on the Milwaukee-Chicago corridor. And now there's money to do all of these things. The new carbon reduction program, it's very, very new. I'm seeing that my current thinking is sort of not as a new sort of siloed program of how are we going to redirect transportation, but rather as a new funding source for all the things we've been wanting to do all along. Is it a bike path? Is it charging stations for our buses? Is it purchasing more electric school buses for our school districts? We can finally start to get beyond the government response of, yeah, good idea, but there's no money. So yeah, let's take advantage of these new funding pots, and let's encourage our governments to be using the competitive grant programs to put forth really exciting new stuff. Because even the proposals that get rejected, our governments are now invested in building them. So they don't get funding this time around, it stays on the priority list for the next time around.
Perfect. We have I have about 3 questions I'm hoping to get to in our limited time. Kathy from La Crosse is asking, how do we get more transit and active transportation voices into the decision maker roles? Elevating those people who have that experience into some of the decision making processes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
At the localist level of government, it's just showing up, right? Again, I live in a community, a suburb of 40,000 people. Truth be told, there are probably 30 really active vocal citizens who shape the public dialogue around every public issue around here. It's not that hard to get engaged at the grassroots level, to be one of the 6 people who shows up at the city council meetings. And they'll shut you up by appointing you to the transportation committee, and guess what? Now you've got some power, right?
Yeah. My background is in urban planning, so I know, how some voices who just routinely show up can have kind of an outsized role. There's just participating in that way can make a big difference. We have another question from Cindy. This is a big one, so good luck. How do we end fossil fuel subsidies and put that money towards public transportation?
The first piece of that is highlighting the problem. Be honest. You are all really knowledgeable transportation advocates. Most of you, at least, I think, who are on this webinar today. Were some of you surprised by when I told you that we had subsidized driving to the tune of $200 billion at the federal level over the last 2 decades? If we don't know that, if we're not saying that everywhere we go, we're never going to end this. It's truth to power, right? Let's talk about much more openly about what the problem is. Until the public understands that your elderly grandmother is she is paying taxes so that somebody else can hot rod down the highway, until we get that message out, we're not going to change it.
Agreed, and so many great metaphors in your presentation. I'm gonna take a few of them. So then we have a really quick, not so much a question, but from Jennifer Evans in Milwaukee, saying her concern is, how do we change from a car-oriented culture when our cities are designed and built for cars? There's just so many places in Milwaukee, for example, that are inaccessible by car. It's not really a question there, but I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on.
I misunderstood. I thought I heard you say inaccessible by car.
Or inaccessible. Oh, sorry, inaccessible except by car.
Well, the crazy thing is, when you actually ask people, that's what they want. They want accessible communities. They want walkable places to be. They like the idea of restaurants, cafes with sidewalk seating, not strip malls. So it's a question of showing people pictures. I tried to find it. In fact, I tried to find for this presentation. It was about a decade ago. The Atlantic Monthly had a wonderful essay about restrictive zoning, and they had the cover picture, as I recall, was a picture of a really fun, livable, walkable downtown, the sort of place that I think anyone would feel attracted to. And then you flipped the page and they showed you the 30 zoning violations involved in this that prevented that from existing, right? If we give people a choice, they will choose a more livable. Nobody wants to live in a car-centric community if you actually present the choice to them that way. It's not about banning cars. It's about making places more walkable and more livable.
Great. And one last question I'll get to. We actually have a number of questions pouring in, so I wish we had more time, but we jam-packed a lot in here. So our last question comes from Frank, who says, as an Illinois resident, can you comment on whether we will see more cooperation between agencies? So like in the past, CTA and Metro barely talked to each other, and Amtrak was having difficulty coordinating with other organizations. Can we promote systems and not just individual routes?
I certainly hope we can. In a very particular Illinois answer is, I think that cooperation between CTA and Metro and PACE is much more likely now. Frankly, decades ago, it was CTA was the Democratic patronage place and Metro was the Republican patronage place. Our suburbs are now increasingly Democratic, so you no longer have that, D versus R fight playing out at the transit boards. And so, at least in Illinois, I think there is the ability to force more coordination. Let me take 30 seconds and just tease out one other issue I didn't get to in the talk. A lot of what I was speaking about was the 2,000-year constant of a 30-minute commute. The potential disruption to that is autonomous vehicles. If you can get in your car and sleep, read a book, watch a movie, have sex, during your commute, are you willing to go further than 30 minutes? Does a 2-hour commute actually become something you might be willing to do? And if so, what does that mean to the future of land use? That's the tantalizingly scary threat, I think, of autonomous vehicles. And for me, really drives home that we need to look not to technology to solve our problems, but to good planning and good social decisions.
Amen to that. And there's so many great topics we could delve into. So hopefully we can get you back at some point in the future just to share so much of your knowledge and expertise. So thank you so much, Kevin, for getting this off on the right foot. We appreciate you. Sharing your knowledge and coming in here and getting us started. So, I hope everyone can give a virtual round of applause to Kevin and thank you so much. It's really been a joy. So, given the limited time, we're now going to move on to our active transportation portion. I'm going to throw it over to Susan, who is going to be, if I can, there we go, add a spotlight to Susan and unspotlight myself and share our screen. And we can get the active transportation portion of our presentation going. So Susan, take.
All right, thanks, Greg. While we're getting the right slides up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next discussion is the future of walking and biking in Wisconsin. I think that title pretty much speaks for itself, so I'll just move right into introducing our two speakers today. First, we're going to hear from Caressa Gibbons, who is a program manager with the Wisconsin Bike Fed, which is an advocacy nonprofit organization. She has 8 years of combined experience as a safe routes educator, bike share programming manager, and advocacy organizer for Complete Streets. She does a ton of stuff and has a whole lot of knowledge she's going to share with us today. Our second speaker on this discussion is Ben Lyman, who is a transportation planner with the Greater Madison MPO. He works on active transportation planning projects and provides support to local area bicycle and pedestrian planning efforts. They are the Greater Madison MPO's lead on equity, Title VI and ADA issues, and member of the Dane County Bicycle Map staff team. So Ben also has a background as a ski instructor, mountain bike and hiking guide, community inclusion specialist for disabled adults, and lifelong enthusiast of non-motorized transportation. So I'm really pleased to hear from them. I want to remind everyone to please enter any questions you have in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So take it away, Caressa.
Thanks, Susan. Are you the holder? Oh, yep, you are the holder of my presentation. Wonderful. So thanks everyone for having me here. My name is Caressa Gibbons. I am currently serving as a program manager and the chair of the City of Milwaukee's Bike Pedestrian Task Force currently. And I'm just going to talk to you a lot about passing policy like complete streets at a local level and what my experience has been like. I know that these folks, including Susan, are working really hard to bring safe streets policy like complete streets to the entire state of Wisconsin to build safer and healthier streets across the state. So we're just going to advance to the next slide. So just my journey really starts back in 2018. Even before that, the Wisconsin Bike Federation had intervened in a process for the city of Milwaukee to pass a complete streets policy that, like I said, had already been in progress and they had already drafted. And a lot of work had gone into trying to garner a relationship with the city of Milwaukee that would allow us to onboard more residents and organizations within the community to help curate that policy. So not only spread the good word about it, but also how could it be better. And so, we worked together on a grant to essentially do a campaign, but also co-rewrite the complete streets policy. And in that process, we were down on the ground doing roundtables, walks, rides, definitely sitting directly on practical projects that we're about to launch in the coming year or the next year, and recruiting residents to take us on those walks. So that really helped, I think, garner support, not only from the council, because I honestly thought that they were going to approve that no matter what, but also from residents. So next slide. And that did pass in 2018. But a part of that also was making sure that we had an implementation process going as well. And the Wisconsin Bike Federation worked with the Department of Health, the Department of City Development, and also more residents to put together not only a complete streets tracking module, but also working on community engagement and communication within the department in order to increase the equitable outcomes in development of any given project, whether that was a street project or even a land use project. Next slide. And this is just a part of that process. I helped write the Complete Streets Health and Equity Report in the implementation process. And that was really helpful in creating a stage for how engagement should occur. Next slide. So we also did placemaking models. So I'm currently working on a report on how placemaking models can improve the city of Milwaukee so that residents feel more associated with the neighborhoods that they live in and want to care for them and show others that these are safe places, desired safe places from residents. Next slide. This is just a nice quote from one of the artists and the project managers for this particular implementation phase in modeling. Next slide. We also worked on other projects. We developed HL Friendly Cities program in partnership with MPS, Milwaukee Public Schools. We have done demonstrations on the street advocating for safer streets. And these are some of the implementation projects that have come out of a lot of this advocacy. And now children are dictating what their surrounding campus looks like based off of like infrastructure implementation and using local dollars instead of federal state funding to support those projects so they happen more expediently. Next slide. So I'm just going to wrap this up really quick. These are some of the things that are happening in our community. We have a new mayor. We just got approved to widen the pool for DPW commissioner today as we speak, so that planners can also be a part of the opportunity to become the commissioner. More ARPA and bill spending is coming our way. The new mayor has proposed a Vision Zero plan and a large placemaking plan called Gathering Places. Complete Streets Health and Equity Report will still be coming out. And we're also finishing up a Complete Streets Handbook. Next slide. But these are the challenges. It's my paragraph of challenges. State aid contributes greatly to the pace and quality of our city services and a lot of other things. So we're really pinned down by the state of politics in the state of Wisconsin in terms of how much funding we receive and what we can actually do with the policies that we have. And the quality of the appointment commissioner was in question as of yesterday, but today is forward progress for us. And again, the culture and politics are shaped on our local policies. You know, being crime-ridden city, we fared a lot differently than, for example, this city of Madison post-World War II. So we have to raise the consciousness of others around us, starting with residents right on the ground. And I think that we've made a lot of progress. So I just wanted to get through that as quickly as possible and answer any questions that you might have, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but like that's me in a nutshell. I've got a lot of other things going on, but these are the things that are really pressing at the moment and kind of where we've come since we've been more actively passing safe streets policies and advocating for plans. So thank you. I think that's the end. Yes, that is my last slide. Yes. Okay, so there you go.
Thanks so much, Caressa. I think we're going to hold questions till the very end of everything, because you may find, I saw that there was one at least that was answered already in the chat, and you may find your question is answered after hearing Ben speak as well. So keep them coming in the chat, but we're just going to move right on with Ben.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for having me here today. I'm going to just try and minimize this little window thingy so I can actually see the screen. All right. So yeah, let's go ahead to the next slide. All right. So I'm a transportation planner with the Greater Madison MPO, that's Metropolitan Planning Organization. You can see in the map here, the area that we are responsible for planning in. I'm just going to give you a really brief background about who we are, what we do before getting into the meat here. As the designated Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Madison metro area, we lead the collaborative regional transportation planning process with the adopted mission and vision that are on here. Map shows our official planning boundary, but we do obviously account for travel in and out of the metro area as well as within the area. And we do some planning work countywide, such as the Dane County bicycle map and our countywide mapping efforts. So we do a lot beyond this area, but this is sort of our legal jurisdiction. Go ahead to the next slide. We allocate funding for 2 federal programs that can be used for bicycle and non-motorized transportation projects. We'll get into those a little bit more. By far the largest of those is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Urban Program, and that funds almost any kind of capital project as opposed to operations. We historically receive about $7 million a year in funding for this program, and we use a set of criteria to evaluate project applications and make those awards. Under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, we expect our allocation to increase to around $9 million a year. And you can see here some examples of some of the projects we've recently awarded funding. Second program, you can go to the next slide, please, that we receive a direct allocation of funding for is the Transportation Alternatives, or TAP program. And that funds transit, bicycle, pedestrian projects. We've historically directly received about $600,000 a year through this program, and we award it on a biannual cycle. So every other year, we generally do our awards. That funding amount is increasing, and we estimate that it will increase to around 1.2 million per year. Something that I've actually learned since putting this slide together, that figure is actually based on the Madison area receiving some money from the statewide pool, which in my comment to Anne in the chat recently, we just realized or just learned that that will not be happening anymore. Those funds, rather than being available statewide, will only be available for rural areas. And so our total local apportionment will probably be closer to 900,000 rather than that 1.2 million, since we won't be getting the larger statewide projects anymore. And let's go ahead. And I guess we don't know quite how it works because as Kevin said, it's brand new, but the carbon reduction program, depending on what documents we look at, sometimes it looks as though the MPO will be able to apply for those funds. Other times it looks like we'll be just receiving a direct apportionment that we can then award to other projects. So we don't really know how that's going to work out yet, because it's a brand new program, but that is another exciting funding stream that will be able to be used for non-motorized transportation. I'm going to start with the bicycle network here. We can go to the next slide. And while our region's bikeway network is well developed compared to peer metro areas, there are still a lot of gaps. And in order to substantially increase bicycling levels, we need to complete a connected low traffic stress network. And this map shows key missing links in that network. These are locations where high stress roads, which are, we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. It's the way that the MPO sort of rates our bicycle facilities is by traffic stress. And those areas can interrupt key bike routes, or where gaps in the low stress road and path network force bicyclists to take overly circuitous routes. And building out and completing this connected low stress network should be a priority for bicycle facility investments. Next slide, please. This map illustrates key planned major regional paths that will help complete the regional bikeway network. Some of these are missing links that were shown in the previous map, while others are important paths connecting suburban communities to the Madison bike network, providing high quality routes for recreation as well as commuting. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the MPO uses a level of traffic stress methodology based on traffic volumes, vehicle speeds, number of lanes, the presence of a median or of on-street parking, and then of course the type of the bicycle facility. Is it just a wide shoulder? Is it an actual bicycle lane? How wide is it? Is it a buffered or protected bike lane? And then that goes into our low traffic stress or our traffic stress mapping program. And that's shown on the screen. Next slide, please. So this map shows the percent of additional metro area jobs that are available or would be available within 30 minutes via the low traffic stress bicycle network compared to the metro area jobs that are currently available via that network. And you can note that many of our environmental justice areas, which are shown in sort of the gray angled hashing there. So these are areas of concentrations of minority or low income individuals. And so those, especially in South Madison, North Fitchburg, so sort of the bottom center of the map, if you're not familiar with the Madison area, have really limited jobs, limited access to jobs via that low traffic stress network. So again, closing those gaps is really a priority for us, and making it so that these folks who are already transportation disadvantaged are able to reach a larger number of jobs via that low traffic stress bicycle network. Next slide, please. This map is from our annual transportation improvement program. It shows all of the major bicycle and pedestrian projects that are currently programmed through 2026. So that means there's funding that has been obligated. Someone has money, they're going to be building these projects by 2026 in the Madison urban area. Roadway projects, many of which include bike lanes, are shown in a separate map, not on this presentation. And I should also note that it is MPO policy that when we're funding roadway reconstruction with the SDBG funding that I mentioned earlier, our policy is to only fund complete streets projects. So that doesn't mean there needs to be a transit stop or transit route on every road. It doesn't mean there needs to be a bike lane or sidewalks on every road. Sometimes the context means that that doesn't really work so well. But generally speaking, we want complete streets, and we require them, and won't fund projects that aren't making that effort. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the planned bicycle network improvements will increase the percentage of our primary regional network that is low stress to 91% of those routes. And their secondary network, which are more sort of neighborhood connections, not quite as regional in nature, the percent of that network that is low stress would increase to 67% from current. So really working hard to improve the connectivity of that low traffic stress network in the Madison area. And next slide, please. I'm going to jump over to pedestrians. I think probably everyone on this call knows it, so I don't have to say it, but I will anyway, that even folks who love to drive their single occupant motor vehicles and just feel like they're just the bee's knees and the best thing ever, even those folks start and end every single trip as pedestrians. And so again, when we're talking about advocacy and communicating with folks about the importance of these networks, everybody starts and ends every trip as a pedestrian. So this is not some special set of facilities that's only going to be used by little kids or the indigent. This is a network that we all depend on. So this screenshot shows the pedestrian network geodatabase that the MPO has built for all of Dane County. It's available to the public through the City of Madison Open Data Portal. It's used by local staff who are able to download the files and use them in their own systems. And it includes the location of every sidewalk, crosswalk, accessible curb ramp, inaccessible, i.e. there isn't a curb ramp, but there should be, pedestrian paths, stairs on public sidewalks in the entire county. It was really a huge undertaking that took several interns and myself quite a lot of time and a lot of other staff. But now we have this network that allows us to see these connections in the pedestrian network. And we're hoping to be using this and to assist communities in dealing with ADA transition plans and identifying priority areas for fixing these accessibility issues. Next slide, please. So reliable data on disabled populations is not available at a reasonable geographic scale through the census or the American Community Survey. So in this map, we've used the population over age 60 as a proxy for the population with mobility impairments. And we display that population per acre with inaccessible curbs and stairs from that database that I showed you in the last slide. And this is helping to identify and prioritize areas that require improvements in order to be accessible. And as someone pointed out in a comment on our draft regional transportation plan just the other day that I was reviewing this morning, it's not a matter of making these improvements where it's convenient or where it makes sense to. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, all of these public facilities need to be accessible. They've needed to be accessible for the last 25 years. A lot of communities still have not developed their transition plans, are still not working proactively to address these concerns. So we're trying to get the tools together to really help folks identify where the problems exist and how they can then prioritize those improvements. And next slide, please. So I'd spent about a year, good portion of it, writing this report, the Pedestrian and Bicycle Facilities Policies and Street Standards. And it's really turned into a great resource. I believe that this presentation will be available to everyone afterwards, and so that link will take you right to it. This report was originally intended to compile design standards such as curb radii, local street widths adopted by area communities, and then to list recommendations from nationally recognized authorities, ITE, NACTO, AASHTO. Go ahead, next slide. And so the report sought to not only document existing community standards and national best practices, but also provide information supporting those recommendations and to explain their importance in safe street design so that local staff are able to look at this, pull it out, give it to their public works committee or to their elected officials or to their constituents and explain why they're making recommendations that they are. So this slide shows some example figures from the section on speed and its relationship to street width. And we can go to the next slide. This slide shows example figures from the section on curb radii on intersecting local streets. All area communities, with the exception of the Village of Oregon, require curb radii larger than the maximum recommended radii in the national literature. This results in longer crossing distances for pedestrians, as well as allowing vehicles to corner at higher speeds. So you can see on the left-hand side there, doesn't really matter how wide the street is. If the radius of that corner is enlarged, where R2 is larger than R1, it results in the crossing distance being longer. And it also makes it so that vehicles can turn that corner at a much higher speed. So again, just trying to make it very easy so that folks have that information and can use it in their own local policymaking and design. Next slide, please. During research and development of the report, we added an equity consideration section, covers inequity and safety, impacts of historical disinvestment, impacts of various funding strategies for sidewalk retrofits. Most streets are built directly with public funds. And for whatever reason, many communities require the adjacent property owner to pay some or all of the cost of a sidewalk. So that gets into that. As well as preventing gentrification and displacement related to transportation projects and the MPO's project selection metrics. The map that's sort of in the background there shows the existing sidewalk network and those sort of darker green lines and the Historic Homeowners Loan Corporation or HOLC residential survey security maps. These are the infamous red line maps, and they clearly show continued disinvestment in previously redlined areas. Of the two images, the one at left where the path goes under a bush and ends, does not come out the other side. It's from the East Moreland neighborhood, which is yellow in this map. And then the right image is from Worthington Park, which was a red area in the HOLC maps. And lo and behold, we've got a sidewalk in front of two houses and it doesn't go anywhere. So again, continued disinvestment in these areas. And that should be it for my presentation. And happy to take any questions from there.
Thank you so much, Ben. Also, thank you, Caressa. Wealth of knowledge there. I think we had some questions in the chat, some of which was sort of addressed, but I was seeing a theme basically of people asking about advocacy at different levels. So on the local level, someone asked about their town had the opportunity to create complete streets, but drivers fought so hard that the city can't even paint bike lanes. So asking about how to convince, looks like local officials or people in the community that making streets safer for walking and biking is good for everyone. And then related to that is another question about how to prevent WisDOT from reallocating TAP funds to pay for highway projects. So what I see in the chat is concern for advocacy at all levels. And I think we could hear both of you have a lot of expertise in connecting with the public and also that technical knowledge for actually making these things happen. So if you could each comment on that briefly before we move on to the next session. Caressa, why don't we start with you?
Well, yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear what Ben has to say about this smaller community with hard opposition. But to be honest, I think there's not necessarily a straightforward prescription for that. However, from our perspective, a lot of these things really do just take time and commitment. So, for example, something that might help is if you want to pass a complete streets policy is forming a resident group of interested folks who are interested in hanging on and being a part of a much larger network to gain support even outside of your community. Because our, politics definitely inform that, and they can change over time. But, I think that also the Wisconsin Bike Federation and the 1,000 Friends are trying to work very hard to make sure that communities are more eligible for these types of funding and have support, so that, when it comes time to apply for an application, perhaps there's a state representative, regardless of their political persuasion, that can come in and ease those conversations with some of the local folks. That's something that we're actively doing, in even forming the Trails Caucus, for example, at the state level, to really try to make things less red and blue and more purple, so to speak. So those are just some of the things that are off the top of my head. I wish that there was some sort of expedient way of doing that, but I definitely think that between the Bike Fed and 1,000 Friends and the CMRT, we're definitely there to support you along the way. If there's things that you really want to go after, both on the local level and then on the state level.
All right, I'm going to try and shotgun hit a whole bunch of different questions here. So first, building coalitions and support for projects in smaller communities, or heck, larger communities that just aren't responsive to bike lanes. My ladies from Stevens Point, and they have been freaking out about new bike lanes on a one-way couplet through town that everybody's just so angry about, except the people who are like, of course we need bike lanes, it's fine. So I think that one of the really great ways to go about undercutting opposition is to build coalitions of disparate groups. Go to your senior centers and talk to people who don't drive because of medical health reasons, whatever, and they or their partner or their friends are in wheelchairs or using a walker, or even if they're just using a cane. Curbs are really difficult. And so there's one advocacy group that bicycle advocates don't usually think about. Go to your youth organizations, daycares, NIAC, young children education, because little kids, we want them riding their tricycles on the sidewalks. Now, when you get the seniors and the children advocates working together, it's really hard to argue with them about complete sidewalk networks, because it's not politics. It's your children and your grandma. So I think that that's a really strong coalition to reach out to and to build. And it has great advantages, because you can also help improve your ADA compliance. So the Department of Justice isn't going to come fine your community for not having an accessible system. So that's a really big benefit right there. In terms of transferring funds, there was a comment about the state transferring funds. WisDOT has been, what's the right word? Let's say very aggressive about transferring transportation alternatives funds into highway projects. The BIL, IIJA, whatever you want to call it, prohibits that. They are not allowed to do that anymore. And that's something that we as an MPO are really pushing hard to make sure that they are aware that they can't do that. If they want to move money out of the TA program, they have to have they have to have a solicitation for projects, and that solicitation has to be so poorly followed up on that they just can't spend all the money. Then they have to get the Secretary of WisDOT to approve it. Then they can move the money to a highway project. I don't think it's ever going to happen where there are not enough applications to spend all of that money. So again, I would strongly recommend getting your communities together, putting those applications together, and going after those funds. As I said, the statewide pool of money is going away, and so there will be more money. The same money will be available for rural areas, but you won't be competing with projects that serve urban areas and higher populations anymore. So that, although we're kind of crying in our cups as an urban area, it is really good for rural areas. Those funds are going to be staying in rural areas. I think that was about all I needed to get back to. Susan, thanks for taking care of those acronyms.
Yes, and I think we need to move on to our next session, but just so everybody knows, I've been capturing all these questions from the chat and all the links that were shared and the spelling out of all the initialisms and things. So when we send out our follow-up, all those things will be available there. So if you didn't look something up or click on something, don't worry. Thank you again, Ben and Caressa. Over to you, Greg.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben and Caressa, for joining us. You know, we're having such a great and robust conversation that we're you know, running a little bit long. We had scheduled a 5-minute break. I'm maybe just going to make that a minute or two, so folks can get a chance to stand up and stretch your legs, and then or use the restroom, whatever you need to do. We'll be back here in just a minute or two. We'll hand it over to Megan, who will be leading our conversation on public transit. Some really excellent work happening there. So just take a minute or two and we'll be right back. All right. Well, we can start getting the show on the road again and people will be filtering back. And we're going to hand it over to Megan Severson, who is going to be helping us and talking about the public transit in Wisconsin and kind of what the future holds a little bit. So Megan, take it away.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. This is an excellent forum. Thanks so much, Greg, for all your work. So my name is Megan Severson. I am volunteering on behalf of Thousand Friends of Wisconsin, WISPIRG, Wisconsin Public Interest Research Group, and the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation. So really happy to be here today. I'm excited to introduce our next two speakers for this next half-hour session on public transit and its future in Wisconsin. So we have Ian Ritz. He is the Chief of Transit Section at the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. Ian has worked there since 2010 and is passionate about public and specialized transportation services because they provide mobility options for all Wisconsinites. Patricia, or Patty, Kiewiz is the City of Green Bay Metro Transit Department director. She joined in 2004. And in 2020, one highlight, Patty implemented the first public micro transit service in Wisconsin called GBM On Demand. So with that, I will turn it over first to Ian. Ian, you have the floor.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's been really enjoyed the presentation so far. It's it's a great opportunity. I see some familiar names and faces, but new people as well. So it's I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to touch on a few different things. If you can go to the next slide. Just real quick, because I want to provide an opportunity for questions at the end. So I'll be just pretty brief, going over a few things. Just a little bit of highlights of transit in Wisconsin, some of the impacts which have been notable due to COVID-19 on transit. Kind of touch on some of the current biennium budget and some of the changes there. And then also getting onto the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then an initiative that Wisconsin DOT has had for the last couple of years related to non-driver advisory. So next slide, please. Wisconsin has quite a diverse range of transit services. Over 70 public transit systems. The most common ones that people think of are Milwaukee and Madison. Obviously, they're our two largest transit operations, but there's so many others. We have rural, we have small urban, we have county services. We've got a variety of things. Overall investment, combined federal and state, it's over $230 million. Pre-pandemic, we were seeing about over 50 million passenger trips annually. About 55% of those trips were for work. And as I sort of alluded to in the overview, COVID-19 has had significant impacts on transit in Wisconsin. We'll come on to that in a little bit. Next slide. And I always want to share this map because I think it's it's useful to see the kind of the coverage and diversity in transit services. Like I said, we've got county-wide, multi-county services. We've got shared ride taxi in small communities. We've got a lot of bus systems. We have intercity bus routes. So it's really, obviously not the entire state, but there's pretty strong coverage throughout north, south, east, west parts of the state. Next slide. COVID has impacted transit as it's impacted so many parts of our life and society. It's I would say service levels have returned back to normal, or close to normal. Early on, we had a lot of reduction in services. Communities were shutting down altogether, reducing hours, routes, things like that. Gradually, those have recovered. Ridership, we've seen significant changes in ridership patterns. So on both these tables, you can see on the left is pre-pandemic, and both tables for the shared ride taxi and bus services, and then pretty notable drops in 2020, and we're seeing kind of slight recoveries across shared ride taxi and bus. We through the end of last year, 2021, the taxi services recovered to maybe 60-65% of where it was before. The bus systems are maybe 55% or so of where they were before. So we are seeing positive trends, but we anticipate a pretty slow recovery in ridership. As Kevin alluded to in his presentation, we don't know the future. We're kind of making as predictions and best judgments as we can right now, but we don't know how this is going to really play out over the next 1 to 2 to 5 years. With lost ridership means a lost revenue, and that's obviously impacted budgets. But there's been some other things that have shown up, impacts to note in terms of labor, bus drivers, transit drivers, costs, supply chain issues. Fuel costs are very high right now. Availability of vehicles, parts, maintenance items, things like that have all been affected. So it's there's been kind of these ripple effects throughout the the transit community in Wisconsin. Next slide. How has WisDOT tried to support? The main the main thing we do is try to support the local communities. They're the ones front and center providing the services to members of the public. So we try to help them as best as we can in terms of monitoring service changes, providing some greater flexibility in some of our programs where possible, try to allocate the federal COVID relief funding as quickly and efficiently as possible across the three main funding programs that have been created. We try to coordinate information with our Department of Health Services, a lot of data collection, just provide a lot of technical assistance, which is answering questions and helping interpret information. Next slide. Be brief here. We're in the midst of this right now. We're actually, kind of looking forward to the next biennial budget as well, the 23 to 25 budget. But it wasn't so long ago that this current budget was signed, and we had some increases to modest increases to a few state aid programs, which we were pleased about, related to paratransit and specialized transit, and then also our WeTap program, which is employment transportation assistance. Next slide. So I want to spend a few minutes touching on this. Again, it's been a topic of conversation throughout the morning. At WisDOT, we've done quite a bit of analysis on the bipartisan infrastructure law, IIJA is sometimes called as well, and just looking at the main transit programs for Wisconsin over the 5-year period of the bill. We anticipate, almost $150 million increase over the base funding. The priorities, as have been said at the federal level, relate to safety, modernization, climate, and equity. Those are the 4 kind of pillars in the transit area. Across the different programs, we see about a almost 27% increase in the first year. That's this federal fiscal year, right now. And then it's kind of more incremental increases after that, about 2%. And in terms of a dollar amount, we're across all the programs, it's about $25 million increase in this first year of the bill compared to the last year of the FAST Act, which was the previous federal reauthorization. And that table there, it's a little bit of a snapshot of kind of the key formula programs that we have in Wisconsin. There are some other ancillary dollars that I didn't include just to kind of keep it a little bit simpler, but it's for planning purposes, urban public transit, specialized, which is when I say specialized, that I refer to transportation programs for seniors and individuals with disabilities, rural public transit, and the bus and bus facilities. The bus and bus facilities is a capital program. And overall, what we expect to see, and we're going to work with local partners to help, facilitate all this, is, we expect more, facility projects, vehicle purchases, potential, service increases, things of that nature. And, definitely, positive funding increases across all these programs. The one thing I'll just highlight, because it kind of stands out from this table, is that Section 5339 bus and bus facilities program. If the formula increase is pretty modest, around 3%. What the bill program did in general was it really provided a lot of more funding on the discretionary side of that program for low and no vehicle emissions, but then also kind of more conventional projects. So just the nature of the program is it really generated a lot more funding for these discretionary opportunities where communities can compete for different projects on a national scale. So that's why that one is just a little bit different, and I just wanted to point that out. Next slide. And the last thing I'll touch on, and it's something that's been in place for a couple of years, but it's something that I'm proud of and the department is proud of, is the department convened a non-driver advisory committee. It's a group of a variety of different stakeholder groups that have been meeting on a periodic basis, usually kind of 2 virtual meetings per year. I know 1,000 Friends has been, invited and has participated in that, but then a lot of other organizations as well. And it's really kind of looking across the board at transportation services, barriers, opportunities, policy recommendations, et cetera, for the non-driver community, which is kind of across the board, disabled individuals, seniors, transit dependent individuals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a really positive group. We have another meeting coming up in a couple weeks, actually, toward the end of May. It's just something that I think has been a really positive initiative and have been pleased to be a part of. So with that, you can go to the next slide, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. So before questions, we will move on next to Patty Kiewiz, who is the transit director for the city of Green Bay Metro. So Patty, take it away.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. So I think it's been very good, a lot of good information this morning, and obviously a lot of passion for transportation, which I love. So with that, we'll just get started. And so if you would just go to the next slide for me, please. I just kind of wanted to start with that. I'm Patty Kiewiz. I am the director here in Green Bay, been here for about 18 years. And so I've seen our transit system change quite a bit in my time, just from kind of the traditional spoken hub type system to where we are today, which is, a very robust system that includes several different modes of transportation. So if you could go just to the next slide. And one thing, when, back in 2011, we implemented some different transfer points and those types of things. I think over the years, what we continue to see in Green Bay, and I'm sure it's similar in many other communities as well, is you get a lot of that suburban sprawl and a lot of that development on the outskirts of the cities. And so it always creates some challenges for transit, and how do we service those and provide good service. And so that's where this tends to lie in the public sector. As we here in the city of Green Bay, we have multiple communities like Ashwaubenon and Alloway and Bellevue, and all of those areas where businesses will open doors, and colleges and those types of things, and we need to be able to service those areas, and it gets to be a challenge being able to provide frequent service on a regular basis. And so over the years, we've, kind of made quite a few changes with offering, different transfer points where people can transfer en route, save some time not coming back down to the main transfer hub, and those types of things. And I think over the years, we're very heavily funded by state and federal dollars. And so as those dollars fluctuate, of course, that truly affects the level of service we can provide. When we see, reductions in funding, it's no secret, it results in service changes for us. With the fact that that's what we do, is we provide service. So, that's always a challenge, and that's something that we have struggled with in our community. And so one of the things that, as I look, and I have envisioned years back on using, some type of a dial-a-ride, some type of demand response service in collaboration with our fixed route. So I had some neat ideas, but getting us there is a challenge in itself at times. And so I started down that road, implementing pieces, certain pieces at a time, to kind of build us to where we needed to be. And, the pandemic, as much as that created some huge challenges for our industry, ones that we probably never would have envisioned being, up against. Also for us, I think provided a silver lining as well. It provided us the opportunity to try some things outside of the box. And, I think the environment that we were all put in, I think people were more willing to try things that were different as well, which, working in public sector, I'm sure everybody it can be a challenge in meeting everybody's needs and wants and those types of things. And so, as we went through, I was already looking at some on-demand type services, and it just so happened, we had our paratransit contract, which our paratransit program in Green Bay is what we call a turnkey operation. So it is completely contracted out, the rides and, providing the rides, scheduling of the rides, the entire program is contracted out. And so that is a contract we go out typically every 5 years on bid. And so we had awarded a new contract to Via Transportation in the fall of 2019 with them to start the new contract in March of 20. As we all know, that's when our world kind of flipped upside down and changed things quite a bit for us. And so, we went ahead and launched the microtransit as planned. Via did a phenomenal job considering what we were up against on making that change occur and staying on track. Through those changes, and a lot, we went to such drastic drops in ridership and those types of things. And so it gave me the opportunity to launch our pilot for microtransit services. And microtransit services is, truly a demand-based program, and it's really technology driven, which is great. It uses, some of the same technology as Uber and Lyft. And so it really, in my opinion, provided a great opportunity for our community to be able to have an on-demand service that would complement our existing fixed route. So the goal that I was aiming for our was for not to have microtransit replace fixed route or vice versa, nothing like that. My goal was to get these different modes of transportation to be seamless and to complement each other. Because as our community and our system grows, and you keep having needs on the outskirts of a lot of the communities, it may not be efficient or cost effective for us to provide a fixed route bus service on the outskirts of town 16 hours a day. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is when we don't see a need, too large of a need, the service ends up getting reduced, which in our world, when service is reduced, you tend to get less people riding it, which then service ends up being reduced more, and it's that downward spiral. So unfortunately, reducing service is one of the worst things we can do when we're trying to grow a system. And so, I think with looking at implementing the pilot and moving forward, what we did is we selected an area on the east side of our community that really was on the outskirts. It had lower ridership, but we launched that pilot in August of 2020. And we were able to really, utilize that area, making sure that it was what we envisioned. We were able to make some changes and tweak as we went, with not affecting quite as many individuals as we would have pre-COVID. If we, had a series of public information hearings and input, and I'll be honest, it was very different for our community to grasp the change. And I think that it even would have been more challenging pre-COVID, but given the environment that we were going through and everything changing, I think people also grasped that change and were willing to go along with it and give it a try, because everything else so flipped upside down. So we really used that to our advantage. And so we launched that in August of 20. We then turned around and held some more public meetings the following spring in May. And then we went ahead and launched expanded version of that. So if you just go to the next slide, please. You know, this just kind of goes through a little bit of, you know, background information on our relationship with VIA being our paratransit provider. And then also they are known nationwide for microtransit services. So we were very fortunate to partner with them and have them assist us through this transition of a new mode of transportation. The other thing that I think is very unique to our service is that I wanted to utilize you know, same vehicles as much as we could. I think it's the most cost-effective way to do it. And I think, you know, paratransit is required and a well-needed service. However, there are downtimes during that service as well that we could utilize those same assets and those same drivers and those same vehicles to assist in our on-demand service. So that was one of, you know, the things that I envisioned of that seamless piece of transportation that I had brought up. If you could go to the next slide. This just was originally the pilot area that we did. That orangish light yellow is the entire service area of our system. The greens are where we launched the pilot. And it went, I mean, it was different. And, you know, as with any pilot, we were able to make some adjustments. And as we received feedback from the community on what worked for them, which then brought us to, if you go to the next slide, which then brought us to this expansion in August. So from that point where we really had this pilot going for about a year. During that time, I had developed a committee, a service development team that had met, and it was consisted of some of MPO staff, which is our metropolitan planning organization, in addition to some riders, and in addition to operators and various metro staff. And we really took our service map and started from scratch. And we said, okay, where do we see the need for fixed route? Where do we see high levels of that need? And we really focused on pre-pandemic numbers, not knowing how things would return, when they would return, what new normal would be. We really focused on pre-pandemic numbers as we made decisions on providing this type of service. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up creating 4 different zones. And so the overall summary of what we did with our system is we took our system map and said, okay, here is where we see the heaviest used area, the busiest locations. And then we from that point said, okay, now where else do we see needs and neighborhoods that we have to hit, and employers and those types of things. And then based on that ridership data and feedback from the community is where we determined that we would utilize microtransit to help meet those needs. And so we then took this 4-zone system, and we, you know, have that intertwined with our fixed route. And so through all of the shuffling and redesigning of our system, we redesigned everything. All of our fixed routes but 2 changed. So it wasn't just as easy as saying, okay, here's microtransit. Here you go, Green Bay. This is going to be awesome for us. We really had a lot of tweaking to do because of the fact that we designed the system to bring individuals from outlying areas, maybe that didn't have no transit or had very minimal transit services. We wanted to get them to a transfer point where they could then utilize the fixed route system to maneuver where they needed to go. And in order for a system like that to work, we really needed to increase frequency. And that is one thing that we need to do, is to, make sure that we are increasing that frequency. So if you go, and I'm going on here, so I want to wrap up. The next slide, please. This is the all system, and you can see the yellow, that's our whole fixed route system. The yellow is paratransit. We designed it to a point where all of the microtransit zones will come into a fixed route transfer point that is then serviced every 30 minutes to allow for frequent services to get around the community. So that's a huge plus for us, because we had many 60-minute routes. So this system has gone over very well for us. We are working on expanding, hopefully, into other communities and further out with microtransit, being able to meet our needs as we do that. So we're super excited for that. And then the next slide, I know everybody's been talking about infrastructure bill monies. So, some of Green Bay's priorities with utilizing those dollars going forward is we want to continue to increase service hours. We feel with the changes that we have made that service is where it needs to be for Green Bay. However, service hours is something that we want to continue to expand on. And then obviously we would like to look at modifying fare structure. It was important to us with the microtransit service to have a flawless system. So our fares are the same across microtransit and fixed route. Fare structure is something that has been very important to our community on keeping fares down. So that is something we want to continue to visit to see with some of the additional infrastructure dollars, if we're able to do something there, as well as vehicle replacement and continue to upgrade some things on the facility. So that is, the big project we had going on. So I appreciate everybody listening to me. I can rattle all day on this. This is something I'm very passionate on, and I think has been very beneficial to our community. And we are really looking forward to being able to continue expanding services to our greater Green Bay area.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patty,
Yes,
for all of that. And thank you, Ian, as well. We've gotten some wonderful questions in the chat, and thanks, Ian, for responding to a couple of them there. Really going to take just a few minutes here so we can stay on schedule with the rest of the forum. But if your question doesn't get answered, we are noting them, and we will follow up with you with responses, but also encourage you to follow up with the speakers directly. A lot of interest here in more details about the microtransit service. One question Sherry Gruder posed in the chat was directed to Patty, but I think both Ian and Patty would love to hear more from you, whether you've applied for federal funding for electric buses or anything else that you'd like to share relating to the transition to electric buses. So maybe Ian, if you'd like to start on that topic.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think going back a couple of years ago, actually, WisDOT applied for and was successful in getting a discretionary grant from the Federal Transit Administration for low and no emission program. And we're actually working to implement some electric vehicle projects in some of our rural public transit agencies. We coordinated with them on the application. So that has been a positive thing that we've done a couple of years ago. Going forward, that's something, as well that we're, that's on the table, where we are, for example, we're currently working to reestablish a contract for heavy-duty transit buses, which are the main, the main size vehicles in your fixed route bus systems. And we're looking to add an electric bus to that contract, which would facilitate local partners from purchasing. I would say in general, there's some pretty significant planning that, like, operational analysis and planning, as well as infrastructure analysis and planning, needs to go into these types of projects. It's not just as simple as you can throw a electric bus on whichever route you want. And Patty can probably get into the more details on that. But that, I would say in general, it's an important consideration.
Thanks, Ian. Patty, you're on mute.
Thank you. Just to add off of what Ian said, there's a lot into deciding to go the avenue of electric buses. It doesn't happen just overnight. We have been doing quite a few facility upgrades over the past couple of years with various funding that we've been able to secure, which, as we make these upgrades, we are keeping the electric bus in mind. So that helps prepare us. An example is just redoing those in our garage. Those all need to be replaced when you're doing types of things. So we are definitely headed that way. The state of Wisconsin has been very fortunate with VW money over the past few years. Then, and so communities were able to decide if clean diesel or electric was the best for their community. I think from a bus perspective, our state was behind tremendously in bus replacement. So for some areas, purchasing clean diesel was just worked out more cost effective for them to replace, 1980 buses or 85 buses or whatever might have been the case. But it is an avenue we are going down. The city of Green Bay just received some dollars as we are preparing a climate action plan that we will need in place as we move forward. So it is somewhere, direction that we are headed. But I think, even with what we did with the microtransit services, I think that really helps in reducing greenhouse gases and all those things in the bigger picture as well. I mean, we removed several fixed route buses off the road, replacing them with smaller type vehicles, which, all assist in helping that reduction of emissions as well. So, but we are headed that way. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. And for time, we're going to move on to the next section. So I will hand it back to Greg, but just wanted to thank both our speakers for taking the time out of your day to be with us today virtually. And thank you for all of your work.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Patty and Ian and Megan, for helping run that. And thank you for everyone who's stuck around. We're on our last section, and so we're headed to passenger rail. And so we're really excited to have some real experts with us. Today we're going to be here from Tom Lynch. Tom has over 25 years in the transportation planning field. His efforts have resulted in more than $500 million of infrastructure improvements. He currently serves as the Director of Transportation for the City of Madison, and he has a lot of ongoing initiatives, including bus rapid transit, Vision Zero, complete green streets, and transportation demand management. Tom has lived with his wife, Melody, in Madison for 30 years and has 4 grown children, and in his free time enjoys backpacking, canoeing, and biking. And he's going to be joined today by Arun, who has 18 years of experience in transportation at WisDOT and has worked on public transportation and passenger rail since 2006. Since 2012, Arun has been responsible for planning, policy, program, and implementation of passenger rail at WisDOT here in Wisconsin. And he currently serves as the chair of the 23 States for Passenger Rail Coalition and is the vice chair of the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. So first out the gates is Tom Lynch. So I will go ahead and give Tom the spotlight and hand it over to Tom. Thank you for joining us today, Tom.
Great. So I'll go ahead and do my part to try and get us back back on schedule. This is an interesting picture. I just thought I'd open up with this. This is a rail card. You know, the city of Madison had a fairly good rail and trolley system, and this goes over the Harrison Street viaduct. Next slide. I'll just go over a brief history of the passenger rail in Madison, some of the recent studies and our current efforts. History. So the first passenger rail entered Madison in 1854. It really entered on the west side of Madison, so over there by the West Washington. The Chicago Northwestern constructed their line in 1864, and that's the line that you actually see that crosses Monona Bay. And then the current East Side, I should say, they had an East Side depot, and then they had a second East Side depot that was constructed in 1910. This picture right here is a passenger rail. You can see it, and it's right by Blount Street. It's just kind of interesting. If you look hard, you can actually recognize a couple of the buildings that still exist in this picture. Go on. Next slide. This was actually the first Chicago Northwestern passenger rail station on the east side. And this was replaced in 1910 by the next slide, which is now part of the MG&E plant building. If you look at it, this building right here was constructed in 2010. It incurred some delays because they wanted to make it a little bit larger and close off Blount Street. And the city really was very much against the closing of Blount Street, and so they decided to build and a smaller station that was still considered one of the best in the Northwest Chicago Northwestern network. Next slide. In the 1940s and 50s, Madison was served by the Minnesota 400, the Dakota 400, the Rochester 400, which made its last run in July 23rd, 1963. And then the last run to Chicago was made in July 21st, 1961. The 400 refers to that steam engine, which I didn't really realize that, but I guess it was a fleet of locomotives that was quite popular at that time. So really, we've been without passenger rail since the 1960s. Next slide. Recent studies, or I should say more recent studies. This is a listing of some of the studies that have occurred that talk about different types of rail. It includes both the journey trip that we just learned about at the very beginning, as well as commuter trip. Next slide. In Madison, we've had quite a few, most of them focusing on the commuter trip. In the 80s, Dane County had the technology corridor study, which really looked at light rail. And then the Dane County Transit Priority Corridor study, also looking at light rail. The 1990-92 light rail transit corridor study. In the mid 1990s, we kind of shifted to evaluating commuter rail, which would use a diesel. And then 1998, the Dane County Commuter Rail Feasibility Study. And all of those kind of previous studies morphed into the Transport 2020 Commuter Rail Alternatives Analysis, where the city of Madison and the county and WisDOT actually submitted a new starts application, small starts application. And it was really kind of coupled with the Midwest Rail Initiative, or the High Speed Rail Initiative. Next slide. These are just, it's kind of interesting when you look at some of these old documents. If you look at this is the potential light rail corridor identified by 1997 by Dane County. And if any of you are familiar with our BRT, previous slide, that looks an awful lot like our BRT line, doesn't it? It's actually essentially the east-west BRT line that we will be implementing in 2023. Next slide. This is a commuter rail corridor. And then next slide. This is the Transport 2020 This was submitted to FTA and the Small Starts program for comment. Because there wasn't really a good operational funding source, they actually recommended that we kind of pause and we look at different technologies and ways to deal with our commuting transit traffic. And really the pause on Transport 2020 essentially became the start of a lot of our bus rapid transit efforts. Next slide. Arun perhaps will talk a little bit about this. Probably Madison's most recent and highest probability of getting intercity passenger rail had to do with the 2010 Milwaukee to Madison passenger rail corridor study. This also ended up with an environmental document. If you look at the right, that's from one of the alternatives analysis, and it evaluated 5 different station locations. At that time, I think the governor, along with the city, selected the downtown passenger rail station, or the Monona station, which is shown kind of on the left there. And then that all kind of got paused with the changing of the political dynamic. Next slide. Our current efforts, next slide. The bipartisan infrastructure law really could be a game changer. This is one commentary on it. The IIJA, which is often called the bipartisan infrastructure law, two different names for the same thing, delivers big for passenger rail, providing $66 billion to Amtrak to improve and expand service. This is the largest investment ever for the nation's intercity passenger railroad, which previously had an annual budget of $2 billion. So pretty dramatic statement there. When the bipartisan, next slide, when the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed, we looked into it. We've been interacting with Amtrak because there is a desire by city officials to get Amtrak back to Madison. And they actually say that perhaps our greatest funding potential will occur in the federal state partnership grants for the national network, which has a funding allocation of $12 billion. Next slide. Consequently, as the bipartisan infrastructure law was being passed or was in negotiations, Amtrak released the Connect US plan. They, as one of the first phases of the Connect US plan in the Midwestern state, they recommend extending 4 daily Hiawatha trips to Madison, with 3 extending on to St. Paul, Minneapolis. So we're a key part of that plan. And then the next slide. The Midwest Regional Rail Plan was released in October of 2021. If you look, it includes Madison in its passenger rail network. If we pull some excerpts out of that report, it says Madison is seen as a significant market critical to operational viability of the core express corridor between Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and that it should be included in any mainline route and alignment. Further, Madison was identified as part of the core express service, the backbone of the network with the highest ridership potential. So we've got a lot of documents recently that are really advocating for the extension of passenger rail to Madison. The city of Madison wants to really take advantage of that, and the new funding that's really going to be available for about 4 years, right? It's really almost like a blink of an eye. And so if we want to get passenger rail, now is the time to do it. This year, next slide, for us, the focus is on Amtrak's Connects US, which is really the extension of a highly successful Hiawatha service to Chicago. I know I've been in several rail meetings, and many people like to spout high-speed rail and can we have trains that go 110 miles an hour, but as we interact with Amtrak, they feel like they can reach more places and get this done quicker if we can just get some of the passenger rail going. And being honest, a 20 or 25-minute difference to Chicago isn't that big a deal, for us. This is a quote that's actually taken right out of their Connect US document that says Amtrak is proposing to implement conventional rail service in the near term that would create or expand initial markers for intercity passenger rail service, and then feed complementary high-speed rail services once built. Next slide. For us, we are trying to understand where a station would be if it were to be in Madison. We want to kind of encourage these efforts along as much we can and be as supportive. We issued an RFP. A resolution will be going to council on May 10th, granting us the approval to start a contract, and we'll probably be doing a lot of that planning this summer and fall. We've submitted a budget request for some pre-NEPA work for the 2023 budget. And then, as our mayor interacts with federal officials, she has these discussions with our delegation as well as the Federal Rail Administration and the like. And so that's my portion. And then Arun has a pretty good slideshow too. So why don't we just go right into him?
Great. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation, Tom, and the transition. So yeah, we'll throw it over to Arun, and folks, if you have questions, we'll get to them at the end. So thank you, Tom, and take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and appreciate the opportunity. I'm Arun Rao, the passenger rail manager for Wisconsin DOT. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about the Wisconsin's intercity passenger rail system, and I apologize I didn't have the map up here, but it really consists of the Chicago-Milwaukee Hiawatha service, which is our only state-supported service right now, and then the Amtrak Empire Builder long-distance service for Chicago to Seattle and Portland, which goes through the state, serving in addition to the Chicago-Milwaukee corridor, it serves Columbus, Portage, Wisconsin Dells, Toma, and La Crosse. In addition to those rail routes, though, we see our rail network, or Amtrak network in Wisconsin, to include intercity bus, and that includes the state-supported 5311 intercity bus routes that interline with Amtrak at some of our Amtrak stations. So you can go on Amtrak.com, for example, and buy a ticket from Wausau to Chicago. But it also includes a dedicated Amtrak Hiawatha through that we'll talk about in a moment. So first, on the Hiawatha service, again, that's our only state-supported route. Wisconsin's a primary sponsor of that, with 75% of the operating support needed. Illinois contributing 25%, and that offers 7 round trips daily. A very robust, successful service, 89 minutes, 92% on-time performance, serving Milwaukee Intermodal Station, where there's a lot of connections to intercity bus and local transit. Milwaukee Airport with the rail air connections, but also a lot of ground transportation connections. Sturtevant, Glenview, Illinois, and Chicago Union Station. And in 2019, we hit a record high ridership of over 880,000 riders pre-pandemic. We're seeing ridership. Obviously, we dropped down to below 50% of that during the pandemic, but we're now seeing a rebound, and we're trying to work with Amtrak to get coaches added as soon as possible to the Hiawatha to meet that increasing demand coming out of the pandemic. We did resume daily full 7 round trip schedule on the end of March. Next slide, please. And so also as part of our contract with Amtrak for the Hiawatha service, we also have added in 2019 an Amtrak throughway coach connection to serve Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, the Fox cities, and Green Bay. And that really extends the benefits of the Hiawatha service, helps extend it up that I-41 corridor. So this offers, and we saw that corridor, we saw it lose Greyhound service, back in 2018, left with only a couple of round trips, one to two round trips along the entire corridor. So this really significantly improves service on that corridor. And so it offers 2 round trips daily for this dedicated Amtrak throughway service. It launched in July of 2019. And we have full service running now. And it enables the same day round trip from Green Bay to Chicago with a time connection to Hiawatha trains in Milwaukee. And ridership is growing significantly now, actually, in the past few months, and we've even beat our pre-pandemic startup ridership. So that's very positive. Next slide, please. And so as part of our Hiawatha management with Amtrak, we've joined with 3 other Midwest states, Missouri, Michigan, and Illinois, in a acquisition of new Siemens Venture car equipment to replace the Amtrak equipment that was running on all the Midwest routes, and that includes the Hiawatha service. So as part of this procurement, which is led by IDOT, the Hiawatha will be getting 6 of these new coaches this year, probably go into service in about a couple months, and that will help equip 50% of the equipment for the Hiawatha need. For the other 50%, we had to do a supplemental grant application with the FRA. We were successful in getting that, and so we are now acquiring. Wisconsin is acquiring 6 additional Siemens Venture coaches and 3 cab. And with that, we'll be introducing business class on the Hiawatha service. And that's expected to go in service in 2025, meaning then we'll have all new fleet operating on the Hiawatha. Next slide, please. Benefits to passengers that are important to point out here are improved accessibility is a big one. Wider aisles for wheelchairs, automatic cardboard wheelchair lifts, 3 self-service bike racks per car for roll-on bike access. So that's a major improvement. Passenger information systems, as you can see there with the screens and the for improving ADA. And train line doors for faster boarding and the lighting. So automatic remote control, conductors can control them remotely. Improved seating, at-seat power and USB, and large modern restrooms. And so really, it's the next generation of passenger rail service. So we're finally getting to late 20th century Europe standards here. So that's better late than never. Next slide, please. So one thing that we are really excited about, project we're really excited about at WisDOT right now is the Twin Cities Milwaukee Chicago Intercity Passenger Rail project, and this is a joint project which includes 3 state DOTs, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois, the FRA, Amtrak, the La Crosse County, La Crosse MPO, which has been very engaged and has been a fantastic partner and even contributed funding to it, Ramsey County in Minnesota, and Canadian Pacific Rail, which is the host railroad, freight railroad going through the state. Next slide, please. And what this project does is it adds a second daily round trip passenger rail service on this 411-mile corridor that's used by the Amtrak Empire Builder. So it takes that regional segment of that and adds morning and midday departures from both St. Paul and Chicago. It'll be a little under 7.5-hour travel time. Conventional speeds again here at 79 miles an hour. And service is going to begin, it was planned to begin in 2024, but we're now are able to potentially start that quite a bit earlier. So stay tuned for some future announcements on that. And it serves 13 stations, and they're all existing passenger rail stations in the States. Next slide, please. And so what this really does is it quadruples schedule choices. The different schedule combinations, when you add just one round trip, it quadruples the schedule options for somebody, for example, in Portage to go to Chicago. And it provides an eastbound train that has greater reliability because it's only coming from St. Paul and not from Seattle and Portland. than the existing service, and improves, very importantly, improves intermodal connections through Wisconsin and Minnesota with added rail schedules that connect intercity bus and shuttle services. And this is a big, we don't look at this, you know, passenger rail route in a vacuum, but looked as part of an trying to get an improved and integrated system in the state. Next slide, please. And this map kind of demonstrates that, in addition to showing that, you know, about 60% of the populations in both states are within 30 miles of a TCMC rail station, or 15 miles of a proposed TCMC connecting shuttle service. So as part of this project, we're looking at connecting shuttle services from Rochester to La Crosse, which actually already exists. There's an Amtrak connecting service, but also adding a new one from Eau Claire to Toma for travel to and from Milwaukee and Chicago from the Eau Claire region, as well as looking at seeing if how feasible a Madison to Columbus connection would be for people going west, shuttle connection. Next slide, please. So as part of this, whenever we add passenger service on a host freight railroads, there's railroad infrastructure needs to accommodate that additional capacity needed and mitigate any delays to freight, and making sure that both freight and passenger can be dispatched on time as much as possible. So we have a significant infrastructure project in the La Crosse area, 12 million, and then infrastructure projects in Minnesota. Next slide, please. This is made possible by 2 FRA grants. There's one Christie grant there that's for 32 million for those infrastructure projects. We have the state funding matches required for that. We have all that secured from Wisconsin, Minnesota. We have an Amtrak match. And then we also got a grant for operating support, which is very important, which provides some federal funds to help the states with the operating, paying the operating deficit for the first few years of service. Next slide, please. Our progress to date, we have the railroad agreement, railroad identification, infrastructure identification completed. We preliminary design and cost, the service plan, environmental clearance, and the federal and state funding secured. And so now we are moving on to final design, and that's already begun with construction of those improvements in 23 and 24. And again, the service start date is to be determined, but will be before 2024. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Hiawatha service expansion as well, and that's pretty much focused on increasing frequencies from the 7 round trips up to 10. And so right now we're incrementally building some of the infrastructure projects needed to do that in Wisconsin. We're also continuing the analysis with Illinois and the host railroads on what infrastructure needs are needed in Illinois to enable that to happen. We still got a ways to go here to get to the full 10 round trips, identify those projects, environmentally clear them, and then apply for the federal funding. Next slide, please. But we're not waiting for that. We're moving forward incrementally, building projects in Wisconsin, which will enable us to add an incremental step of an 8th round trip. So one of those projects is Milwaukee Airport Rail Station. It's fully funded. It's under, well, it's just finished final design and will be construction let in August. It's about a $10.1 million project. Again, we received a federal Christie grant for that. And what this does is it adds a second platform. You can see the current conditions on the left there, single platform. And when a train has to be dispatched on the other track, you can see passengers crossing live track there, which is not very much less than ideal. This doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. It's a nice station, but it has outgrown its needs. So we're adding a second platform on the west side of the tracks there at the airport, as you can see in the rendering. With up and over tower and bridge fully enclosed with HVAC and everything, and an expanded building and ready. So it's really going to significantly improve the station and upgrade the station for a real intermodal facility. So very exciting about that. Next slide, please. We have a number of, we have a signaling project near the Milwaukee Intermodal Station that's fully funded also. And so with this project done, final design is going to be starting soon. This project in the airport done, we have CPM agreement to add, CP is the host railroad, Canadian Pacific Rail, to add an 8th round trip once those 2 projects are completed. So that's probably going to be in about 2024 timeframe. Next slide, please. And that's an 8th round trip between Milwaukee and Chicago on the Hiawatha service. That going back to the TCMC is an extension of one of the existing 7 round trip Hiawathas. But next slide, please. The other major project we have going on in the Milwaukee area is the Muskego Yard bypass project. And this is a $54 million project, and it basically creates a new freight main line through this existing rail yard, bypassing the Milwaukee Intermodal Station, freeing up tracks in the Milwaukee Intermodal Station for more passenger service. So a very important project. It adds capacity, and it improves also significant improvements to freight and freight flow through the Milwaukee area, with some community benefits too, with freeing up some crossing closings times, etc. So we're in environmental clearance of this project and looking at final design in 2023. Again, this is funded partially through another federal CRISI grant. So we've been very successful and proactive in getting those CRISI grants funded. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and this a little overlap with Tom, so I'll skip through some of these quickly, but regional, national, intercity plans, funding, and updates. So next slide, please. We have the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 that's underway now. It's an update of our Wisconsin Rail Plan 2030. There's going to be some additional public outreach plan coming up here late in the spring or summer of 2022. So please do take a look at that. If you go to our WisDOT website, you can sign up for email alerts for Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 website. And we'll look forward to your comments on that. There's the Amtrak Connect Us plan, again, which Tom talked about in detail. And then that FRA Midwest Regional Rail Plan, which FRA, is instead of completing an entire national rail plan, they're completing regional plans. And so this Midwest plan was released in October, and the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, MIPIRC, which I'm serving as vice chair now, is working on a follow-up plan, a more detailed, implementation plan following up on this. So next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit more about that commission here. The Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission was formed by Compact. Wisconsin is a member, and it coordinates interaction among states and other entities in the public and private sector, and supports developing a passenger rail service across the Midwest. So it led the Midwest states application to the FRA to do the Midwest Regional Rail Plan. And it provides a legislative authority for Midwest states to jointly own, maintain, and manage that fleet of equipment that I talked about on the previous slide. MIPIRC will be playing a greater role in now upcoming with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation and some funding opportunities for commissions. Be playing a greater role in the region, and so probably be seeing more of that organization. Next slide, please. So there's, and Tom touched on this on the infrastructure bill, and there's a lot of discussion on this. So I wanted to break down a little bit what it actually means, what the 66 billion actually means. And that's, there's advanced appropriations, and then there's authorizations as part of this bill. So the 66 billion is advanced appropriations, which we've never had before, and which is an amazing thing, not only because of the funding level, but because it's advanced appropriations and not just authorized. And that's over 5 years, and 44 billion of that is competitive discretionary grant programs, which all states, local, regional commissions, interstate compacts, Amtrak, all eligible to apply. There are matching requirements again for those 20%, and there's also as part of that advanced appropriations, the non-discretionary funding, which is directly to Amtrak. Which is the other 22 billion. Some of that is to Northeast Corridor, 6 billion, the others to the national network. And then in addition to the advanced appropriations, there's 34 billion in additional authorization over the 5 years that Congress would have to appropriate annually in its budget. So that's another huge opportunity. Next slide, please. So Tom talked about these. These are the different programs and the funding levels, grant programs within the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. Very important is this point out is the restoration enhancement passenger rail grant for operating assistance, and that's what we're using for TCMC. And it's really key for, you know, a lot of some of the biggest issues was the operating support. You know, getting support from states for covering operating support for these state-supported services, and this really helps. And with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it'll cover significant portion of that for the first 6 years, and that's kind of a key period where it's ramping up, the new services ramping up, and you know, by the time you get to 6 years, ridership and revenue will be at a point where state support will be much less than during those first 6 years. So very important. And then the authorization amounts of the 34 billion. Again, there's additional opportunities for Congress to put more money into these programs, even in addition to what was in the advanced appropriation. Next slide, please. And another important component of the infrastructure bill is the corridor identification program that FRA has to put together. And in fact, is going to be coming out with guidelines in May 14th, I believe. So FRA has to develop this program to create a pipeline of passenger projects that will receive preference in FRA discretionary grant program funding. And they're going to be soliciting for projects to enter the program every year, beginning this year. But don't know exactly when that solicitation will be. But funding for service development plans and potentially NEPA environmental clearance, there's also an opportunity for that once you get into this program, before getting into the actual pipeline for final design and construction. Next slide, please. And that is it for my presentation, and thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. It is Arun, right? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
Great. I looked it up. I just had to make sure. Before I make sure I was getting it right. So we have about 5 minutes left, and so I told everyone this would be done by 12:30. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to have some rapid fire questions for you guys that we've just seen in the chat. And of course, I lost it as soon as I stopped sharing. But the first one's for you, Arun. Is how does WisDOT determine like the time slots that come out of Chicago with the used in quotes the good time slots? And are there alternatives to the service to Milwaukee that are like considering dividing the train, or what's being considered there?
The time slots are determined. So Metra, the commuter rail service, we share that track in Illinois for the Hiawatha service. So time slots are there's a lot of factors that go into that, looking at Metra schedules and freight, et cetera, but try to optimize them for you know, where the ridership is. So it's a joint effort between the railroads, Amtrak, and the state.
Yeah, I am sure that's a complicated process that'll probably take a lot of your time. For advocates who are really interested in passenger rail, and we had a number of people join this call who are, you know, interested in passenger rail in Madison. What do you think is the best way for advocates to get involved and help make this a reality?
Oh, we're trying to figure that out too. We're, you know, we will have the station location siting, and that will have public involvement. I think in our contract, we also have interacting with some of the communities along the extension of the Hiawatha. But, you know, it would be unusual for us to sponsor and make applications for this extension. So we're trying to advocate for, you know, Amtrak or assist Amtrak, and maybe even in WisDOT, you know, to the extent that they can help. It's all the things have to align correctly, right?
Yeah, and I could just add our experience with the TCMC. You know, a key to that was getting all the county and municipal support and engagement through there on all those communities, but also the business community. And there was a lot of outreach to the business community, and the business community then, you know, that support was key to getting a really broad level of support across the state for that service.
You know, really exciting updates there with that service as well. And then the last question, Arun, is there anything happening with WisDOT and KRM that is, you know, willing to be shared, or anything you can share there?
Nothing I guess, you know, there is well, you know, Ian, I don't know if Ian is still on the call, but he would be the best person to answer that question, because that kind of relates to transit.
Yeah, thanks, Arun. So WisDOT is actually kind of currently engaging with Federal Transit Administration about a potential capital investment grant. So that's FTA's main funding program for, you know, they call it fixed guideway projects. So, you know, like commuter rail type of things. So we're, like I said, we're currently engaging with FTA. There's been no formal acceptance into the program yet, but, you know, we're contemplating an environmental study around Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee commuter rail service, you know, potentially with, you know, with a private partners as well in for the project. So that's where things stand today.
Awesome. Glad we have so many experts from WisDOT on this call today. Well, I'm going to throw it over to some closing slides. I want to thank Arun and Tom for all this wonderful information about passenger rail. There's clearly a lot of people who are very excited about the potential for passenger rail in Wisconsin. So this is my first time planning one of these forums. So what I'm learning is more time for questions next time around. Clearly a lot of interest and excitement from people. So I promise to get you out of here as close to 12:30 as I can. So just these last couple of closing slides. I want to thank everybody who came and participated today. Hopefully you learned something. You know, I learned a lot today. So many wonderful presentations from our experts. We really appreciate it. We'd like to thank our speakers and to thank our sponsor, Godfrey and Con, who helped make this a reality. And if you want to learn more, we have an upcoming webinar in May about outdoor recreation in the summertime. So, you know, if you can give a round of applause in the chat, and to all of our wonderful speakers. They've been so wonderful to give their time. They're busy people doing great work. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be following up with the recording and the slides. And reach out to us if you have questions, and follow us on social media if you don't already. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.